All right, now looks like a good time to get started. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. My name is Tom Murray. I am the Speaker Series Coordinator with the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications. We are, of course, part of the larger Yale Center for Environmental Communications. The Yale Center for Environmental Communications at the Yale School of the Environment. There we conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behaviors. We teach students and train working professionals, inform and engage the public through environmental journalism, and we support a global network of organizations seeking to build public and political will for environmental solutions. And as to that end, today we have invited Professor John Abraham to be speaking with us. Dr. Abraham is a researcher, professor, and journalist in climate science. He is based at the St. Thomas School of Engineering in Minnesota. He has published widely on global warming with a focus on ocean heating. His work has received great public interest because his team has helped improve our knowledge regarding how fast the Earth is warming. Dr. Abraham also works tirelessly to communicate climate science to the public. He founded the Climate Science Rapid Response Team to provide the public, especially policymakers and journalists, with climate science information. He was a writer for The Guardian UK, and his appearances in print, TV, and internet media are well into the hundreds. And with that short introduction, I will hand it off to him. And I believe you have a presentation.
Yeah, that's right. So I've got a few minutes of, and I'm assuming people can hear me. If you can't, let me know. Okay. Yeah, I've got maybe 20, 30 minutes of prepared remarks, and then I want to open it up and hear from you guys, questions, comments, and find some areas of fruit that scientists and journalists can interact together with. So thanks for that introduction, Tom. So before I get into it, I'm going to answer a question that some of you might have. How the hell did an engineer get into climate science? And I know you're not supposed to swear before noon, but I did anyways. How did an engineer get into climate science? I've taken the climate change problem seriously, and I was for many years, and I was giving public talks on it starting back around 2007 or so. And because my presence was being elevated with a lot of press, I decided I better convert my expertise to climate change so that I had the chops to be a trusted voice in the field. So I actually switched my research and got into oceanography. And in particular, I helped NOAA and NASA improve their ocean temperature measurements. My area of expertise is thermal fluid sciences, so anything with heat or fluids. And I brought that skill to the climate community. It was really a great collaboration because many climate scientists didn't have the engineering background that I have. And of course, I didn't have the climate background that they have, but it was a marriage made in heaven. And I've been doing climate work ever since. So what I'll do is get into, I'm trying to do a share screen here. Host disabled. Tom, is this you? Do you have to enable screen sharing?
Yes, I just realized I have to enable it. My apologies.
All right.
Should work now.
All right, well, let's see. Okay, there we go. So what I wanted to, I'm not going to give a talk about the science, but I'm going to give a talk about a journey and talk about how scientists view the communication world and some of the struggles that we are faced with as we try to engage more fully with the public on the issue of climate change. It's really, really important for journalists to understand the limitations that scientists have, and it's also important for scientists to understand the limitations that journalists have. So with that, I'm going to get right into it. And I want to start out by sharing how I think the public sees global warming. I mean, they see these iconic images of parched earth, hurricanes, flooding, polar bears, smokestacks. This is what the general public think of when they start getting into the topic of climate change. How does a scientist think about climate change? We think about it in terms of energy flows. And we look at how the increase of greenhouse gases is causing an increase of temperatures of the earth. And people on this call are pretty attuned to basic climate science. So I'm not going to go into too great detail, but for engineers, or for scientists, we really focus on where energy is flowing, and we try not to get distracted or overly focused on specific outcomes, such as the ones I mentioned on that prior slide. I'm going to lead off with this image. I give public talks a lot, and I try to connect climate change with emotion and with the desire for social equity. I love this photograph because it's a child, and the child has dark skin. I don't know where this child lives. This child might live in Africa. This child might live in any country of the world, but nevertheless, they are showing a globe to the photographer, and the part of the globe that's being shown is Africa. This means a lot to me because climate change is something that is going to disproportionately affect people who are not in the United States or in Europe or in other developed countries. The impacts of climate change are going to be felt disproportionately by people who, for example, live in Africa, live in areas where subsistence farming is critical for social and economic survival. And people who don't look like me are going to suffer more from climate change, even though people who look like me were the primary causes. So I feel a deep sense of social justice that's called me to engage in communicating climate science to the general public. I train climate scientists on how to give interviews, how to engage the public, whether it's print media, television, radio, whether it's through blogs, whatever the vehicle is. I have worked quite a bit over maybe a decade teaching scientists how to distill their message. And one of the things that I always encourage scientists to do is come up with, and I call it an idea box. It's the takeaway ideas that you want your audience to remember. We have it very often happens that when you talk about climate change, the subjects are complex and the science can be a little nuanced. But at the end of the day, you want your audience to go home with key messages. And here are the key messages that I have used for the last decade. Scientists know the climate's changing. In fact, we've known it for over 150 years. The first study of greenhouse gases was done in the 1800s. This isn't something that Al Gore invented. This isn't something that left-wing socialists or communists invented. This is something that we've known for a long time. This isn't new. But the nice thing is we can solve this problem now. We don't need to wait for pixie dust or unicorns or aliens with super technology to come to the planet Earth to solve this for us. We can solve the climate change problem today. And if we're smart, we can not only help the environment, but we can do it in a way that creates jobs, generates energy, improves national security. So there's a lot of other benefits that society can reap when we take the issue of climate change seriously. In the past, a lot of people have said, I don't want to lose jobs. I don't want to harm our national security. But now with clean energy being rolled out in a very massive and low-cost way in the United States around the world, we see that we can reduce emissions as well as create jobs and improve national security. So there's a lot of these co-benefits. And then the final idea that I try to get across to people who I'm communicating with is there's a cost to do nothing. A lot of people say, hey, John, it's too expensive to do something about this problem. My answer is it's too expensive not to do anything about this problem. We are experiencing hundreds of billions of dollars of climate-related disasters each year. And to ignore that problem is going to cause us to incur more costs down the road. So this is, I encourage all scientists to distill their message into some simple 3 or 4 sound bites. And this is my selection of those sound bites. As Tom mentioned, I do write for The Guardian. So I'm a professor in Minnesota. I also am a researcher, and I do a lot of work, but I also am a journalist, and I write for The Guardian, and I've written maybe 300 articles for them. And I'm just giving you some examples of the articles that I've prepared. This one was from September this year. And I've done papers on all kinds of different subjects, ice loss from the Arctic, as well as ocean heating. But I have been fortunate enough to have been provided with venues that I have been able to use to get my message out to the public. Most climate scientists have not had the fortune of having so many venues to get their message out. And nevertheless, many of them are looking to bring their science to the general, the larger society. Scientists want to convey why their science is important to the general public, but many scientists just struggle finding venues. About 10 years ago, I co-founded a group called the Climate Science Rapid Response Team. And this was founded because my colleagues and I recognize that journalists often are under tight timelines and they want to write stories about somewhat complex issues. And wouldn't it be great if there was a place that they could go to and be connected with a climate scientist? Think of it as a matchmaking service. And through this website, through our organization, journalists can, and we service journalists and legislatures, but most of our business is via journalists. Journalists can come in, type in their name, organization, give their question or the topic that they're looking for in a deadline. And then the Climate Science Rapid Response Team goes out and finds experts in that area. So let's say someone wants to write a story about hurricanes because hurricanes have been in the news. Wouldn't it be great if you could be connected with 2 or 3 hurricane specialists and not have to do the digging to find out who's reputable? That's what this organization does. It connects journalists with climate scientists who are expert on the issues that they're looking at. All right, so I'm going to talk while this slide is going. And what the heck is going on this slide? These are complaints, written complaints to me, or they appeared in the media to me during a single year. This was around the year 2010 when I gave a talk and was attacked on a show called The Alex Jones Show. And I've been attacked by the Rush Limbaugh crew and a number of other anti-science groups. But and you're going to see some of these quotes deal with religion, like the bishop or half-assed Bible college. And that's because I teach at a Catholic university. So that's the genesis of those conversations. But someone tried to get me fired. And there was a letter writing campaign to try to get me removed from my position at the university. I am not showing these to do an, oh me, my life is terrible. I'm showing these to you so you can understand some of the issues that scientists may have to deal with when they go public. It is a contact sport. Science communication is a contact sport. And if a scientist wants to embark on an adventure down the path of conveying their science to the general public, they have to expect or anticipate that some of these kind of complaints are going to come to them. And it begs the question, why would a scientist ever want to subject themselves to criticism like this? I wrote an article for The Guardian, and after I taught a 1 hour and 15-minute class, I came out of the class and I had 36 phone messages to my personal phone that were all hate messages. And it's because Rush Limbaugh had picked up my story. And some scientists don't mind being in a contact sport like this, but a lot of scientists, like to be more private and don't want to engage in activities that are going to get this kind of vitriolic response. So I want you to think about recognize that some scientists, when they engage, will be subjected to vitriol. So how do scientists get engaged? I have this little graph where I'm going to show how scientists might think about the engagement. How do they balance the commitment of time and their professional risk? And what do I mean by professional risk? When I write for The Guardian, I don't get paid for it. I don't get tenure for it. I don't get accolades from my university. when I appear on radio or TV, there's no real benefit to my career except the fact that my science gets out there. But uh, a lot of times scientists have to engage in a way that will not subject them to professional risk. There's very little professional benefit for a scientist to communicate, period. It is extremely rare. I mean, scientists, we don't get grants or tenure based on participation. So there is a hurdle that journalists have to think about when scientists begin their engagement. And some of the examples that I share with my colleagues on how they can participate is, you can write letters to papers. Newspapers love to have scientists write letters. You can work on the legislative process. You can contribute to a blog. Now, this is higher on the professional risk category than the other two. You can work within your professional societies like the American Geophysical Union or other organizations that have outreach. Appear on radio and TV, but this is a real risk because you are going to get, you're likely to get negative feedback. But some scientists, you can speak to community groups, but that now we're getting into a really large commitment of time. And then maybe the highest commitment of time is to have an updated personal faculty website that you keep updating. So this is the space of ways scientists can get involved, and scientists can pick and choose which mechanism they want to be involved with based on their ability to commit time and their ability to incur professional risk. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to some of the communication strategies that we give scientists. The first thing is you've got to distill your message. And I got to tell you, scientists love the weeds. We love the nuance. We love long answers. We love uncertainty. We love to dive into the things we don't know. But when you're communicating with a journalist, that's the exact opposite of what you want to do. The first thing that I tell my colleagues to do is, hey, start out with the take-home message, or don't bury the lead. Tell your audience at the very beginning, what is the key message that you're trying to get across? Scientists do not do this. Scientists never start with the take-home message. We always start with the caveats and the things that we don't know. And if you're a journalist, it's important to recognize that natural tendency for scientists to dive into the weeds right away rather than giving the short take-home message at the beginning. You've got to avoid jargon. I'm going to talk a little bit about jargon later on, but it is critical for scientists to avoid jargon, but nevertheless, don't dumb down the science. This is something I've already mentioned. You want to really focus on what you know, not what you don't know. Focus on the discovery, not the caveats. And a lot of scientists struggle with that. And then, of course, connecting it to people's lives. If you can connect your research or a current event or a climate study to people's lives, it is much more sticky for them. There's something that scientists have to be really aware of, and that's the curse of knowledge. And that is, once you know something, like once you know the earth is warming, or not, once you know that greenhouse gases are the cause, or once you know the oceans are rising, it is very difficult for, well, I bet it's difficult for you as well, for journalists in the climate environmental area, but as well for scientists. It is very hard to remember that most people don't know. And people have very different backgrounds. So scientists have to talk to the level of understanding of their audience, but they have to do it in a way that does not dumb it down or is patronizing. And again, I mentioned jargon. We use jargon all the time, and we have to avoid it in communicating to the general public. So we tell scientists, what's your 30-second story? If you have 30 seconds to distill a message from your research, how are you going to do it? How are you going to do that to a diverse audience who may have varied backgrounds in science and interests in the topic? So why should scientists be involved? Why do I encourage my colleagues to get involved? Well, we have an understanding of the science. Very few people, there are some journalists who are phenomenal at this, but pretty few and far between. And climate change and environmental topics are generally very complicated. And scientists are one of the few groups of people that have a command of the technical issues. The thing is, we're trusted. Scientists are highly trusted in the public. And so when we talk about what we've learned and what our studies have shown, people are generally receptive to our message. And I actually think we have an ethical obligation. I mean, some of us are doing our research based on public funding, using public funding. Well, if the public is paying for it, we better convey the importance of our study to the public. You guys own the science. The public owns the science, and it's our job to relate why the science matters to them. So if a scientist is thinking of becoming engaged, here are some things that I tell them. And some of this is a little repetitive, but that's okay. The audience may or may not have a strong technical background. You don't know. And typically, as a scientist, I will ask who the audience is so that I can tailor my message for them. But it's pretty easy to tailor a message if you have a homogeneous audience. That is, if you've got an audience that, well, like this audience today, you guys all know about climate change and environmental issues. Pretty easy to have a detailed discussion about the issues in play. But what happens if you're doing a radio show? So I've done radio shows in public venues, and a lot of the people there won't have the strong technical background. How do you alter your message to meet everyone at their level and engage them at their level? That is very hard to do if your audience is heterogeneous, where some people are very knowledgeable, but other people are not. And many people confuse different environmental issues. For example, ozone and climate change. That's a classic example. In fact, I read one time that a lot of people thought the ozone hole was a hole created in the atmosphere by the launch of rockets and space shuttles. And we know that's not true, but that's the technical experience or background of some of the people that a scientist might communicate with. And people often confuse the issues. Another classic example is air quality and climate change. I mean, you can have low level, surface level air quality that's very bad, but very little greenhouse gases. Conversely, you can have a lot of greenhouse gases, but very high quality surface air. So people really confuse issues, especially ozone destruction and climate change and air quality and climate change. And as I mentioned earlier, a scientist and a journalist have to identify the key takeaway messages. What are the 3 or 4 things that you want your audience to know when they walk out the door? The 3 or 4 things that they're going to remember, because they're not going to remember anything else. What are the key takeaway messages? And we encourage our scientist colleagues to create those takeaway messages. And this is like I'm a broken record, jargon is going to kill you. And if jargon doesn't kill you, long answers will. How many times have you listened to a radio interview or a TV interview, and the answer, whether it's a scientist or someone else, the answer goes on and on and on and on, and people lose focus. So long answers are killers. So we try to teach our colleagues to give short, punchy answers that get to the heart of what the audience actually wants to know. I'm going to give you some jargon examples. Positive feedback. Positive feedback for most people is your kid picked up the stuff in their room, they clean their room, so they, get an hour with an iPhone. You're reinforcing positive behavior. That's not the case in climate science. Climate change, positive feedback, as you know, it's a reinforcing cycle that makes warming or cooling worse based on an initial warming. So in climate science, positive feedback is a bad thing. In parenting, positive feedback is a great thing. So I never use the word positive feedback. I never use the word aerosol. Most people think of aerosol as hairspray, but scientists know that aerosols are small particulates in the atmosphere that have an effect on climate change. If a scientist is doing an interview and they start talking about aerosols, they have lost the audience. Troposphere. This is just an example of a technical term that people don't know. I mean, if you want to talk about the troposphere or the stratosphere, just talk about the upper atmosphere or the lower atmosphere. That's all you need to say. Don't use words like troposphere. In fact, there's a funny anecdote when the Supreme Court was hearing the case on carbon dioxide and whether the EPA had the right to manage carbon dioxide. Anthony Scalia said, troposphere. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said, I don't know what the troposphere is. Why are you talking about this stuff? And he had a stunning lack of understanding of basic climate science. But part of it is that the people presenting to him didn't do it in a way that avoided jargon. Models. Most people think models are really cute people or little toy trains and airplanes. For climate scientists, models are the computer calculations that we use to predict changes to the Earth's climate. And then I'll do the last two at the same time. Albedo. I don't know what the general public would think about albedo, but we think of it as reflectivity. It's really an important term related to climate change, but it's not commonly used outside of the climate community. And then forcing. Forcing is just added heat or some external event that causes a change to an environment. Most people don't think about that as forcing. So a couple takeaways are scientists and journalists have to know their audience. Find out their worldview and then frame your narrative according to that worldview. Secondly, keep it simple. Just a few ideas that are going to stick with them and use emotion. I want to tell a story. I was doing a radio interview with a reporter, really well-known reporter, Don Shelby. We were both being interviewed by a conservative radio talk show. And we were in the studio. And this guy just got so mad at us. And he said, you know what? I don't want anyone to tell me, that I've got to take care of the climate or that I'm harming the climate. And Don Shelby said, hold on a second. He said, hold on. Let me tell you a story about my grandma. My grandma is as Republican as they can be, but she also conserved. She used things really wisely, and she had a jar of buttons. And the issue was, whenever you would lose a button, you'd go to the jar, find one that looked like yours and sew it on. But if you found a button, you'd put that in the jar. And that's just who she was. She was this deeply conservative person that didn't want to waste anything. And then Don Shelby looked at our interviewer and said, isn't that what true conservative is? Isn't a true conservative someone who's not going to waste valuable resources just because they can? And it was a stunning epiphany for me because my colleague, Don Shelby, had just reframed this discussion using his old grandma, who's a conservative, and she's got this little rusty jar of buttons. And I thought it was a brilliant way to address some of these communication strategies. He knew his audience. It was a conservative audience. He kept it simple and he evoked emotion. And we encourage scientists to do the same thing. I am one of the reasons I do a lot of outreach is that change is possible. And I love images like these two. In the left-hand image, there's a rusty oil well sitting in front of these beautiful zero emission wind turbines. And I think this photograph is taken in Texas. I mean, this is showing us change is possible, economic development is possible. We can leave behind the old and go with the new. On the right-hand side, there's a guy who's making algae-based biofuels that are sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, and he's driving cars with it. Who could be against the message conveyed by these two photographs? I don't care where you are on the political spectrum or where you are with your knowledge about climate change and science, these kind of photos resonate with people. So when I give my climate talk, I typically end with this slide. And this slide is showing my daughters. So I'm a scientist. I love understanding how the earth works. I love making the world a better place. And I love publishing my results and fighting over science with my colleagues, but I'm also a dad. And I've got these two daughters. This is Lilith, she's my wild child. And the redhead was Olivia. And since these are my two biological children, but since these were born, I've been fortunate enough to adopt two more girls. And so I've got 4 daughters. And I want my daughters this is Avery in her home village in Uganda. That's when she was about 2 years old. And now she's a Minnesotan. Look at that. She's on snowshoes and loving life and doing great. And this is Neve, my youngest, who's now about 4. She was adopted from Georgia, but she's Samoan and Puerto Rican. But if you've got kids or if you've got family, they're going to ask you one of 2 questions. They're going to ask you, what, you knew there was a problem. Dad, you knew there was a problem. What did you do to help make this world a better place for us? Or they're going to say, how did your generation have the uncommon courage to take action to preserve this quality of life for us? And I desperately want my daughters and my family and friends to ask me that second question, not the first question. I'm gonna just finish up with a couple more slides. I've done a lot of work in media, and I worked with Science Friday, which is an NPR show, on how do you have tough conversations with at work. There were a number of steps that Science Friday is advocating for scientists who want to be engaged in this area. Step 1, don't talk about polar bears, talk about people's lives. And that's something that echoes with what I said earlier. Another thing that scientists need to do is talk about the benefits of using clean energy. We're at a point right now where you can power your car and your house and your business with wind and solar power at a cost equal to or cheaper than coal. So there's no reason not to be using clean energy. You save money and you save the environment. And we can talk about values. I mean, who doesn't want to create a better world for their kids? Who doesn't want to create a world where there's equity between people from different countries and different faiths? These are universal values that really resonate with people, even with people who are dismissive of the science. Because when a scientist or a journalist goes out especially in a confrontational environment with people who are dismissive, you have to be prepared to not change their mind. You have to be prepared to just make them think you're not evil. I gave a talk in a really conservative part of Minnesota, and at the end of the talk, it was an hour-long talk, and I got peppered with a lot of tough questions. And the reporter said, it was a radio host, he said, you know what? I still don't believe you. I still don't think climate change is happening, but the ideas you've promoted just make common sense. And for some situations, that's a big win. So have realistic goals for your engagement with the public and with the press. Don't think that you're going to change everyone's minds all at once, but look for these little wins. And with that, I'm going to leave. I think that's my last slide. I'll leave this up, and I want to throw this back to questions, comments, and more of a discussion.
All right. Well, if we could have a quick round of applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Abraham.
Oh my gosh! An applause by early on a Thursday. I'm a lucky guy. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, Tom.
No, thank you so much for coming. Yeah, I guess we can open up the floor to questions if everyone is ready for that. Yeah, actually, I would like to just start off, just looking around at the political environment that we exist in today. It seems like more and more, we're in this greater political divide. So it takes so much more energy to kind of reach across the aisle. So how do you think like this strategy of communicating to conservatives and climate deniers works when obviously there's like so much more of a benefit nowadays because there is such a large divide, but it also takes so much more energy and so much more.
That's a really good question. So the way I look at it, so there's a large number of people who are dismissive about the science, but they're not homogeneous. They're not monolithic. They have different levels of disagreement. I don't try to convince everyone. There are some people that are unconvincible, but what I do is I look for moderates that I can peel off, and I look for I look for opportunities to talk about science in a way that is not threatening to them. So let me give you an example. I'm in Minnesota, and we are experiencing climate change that is affecting hunting and fishing. I'm not a hunter or a fisher, but there are a lot of hunters and fishers, and they know climate change is happening. Our moose population has gone through the floor. So people who are outdoors people know they're seeing this. And so I talk about what are they seeing with their own two eyes that confirm what the science is telling them. Another great example is farmers. Look, farmers tend to be dismissive about climate change, but they also know the climate's changing and they know it's going to affect their livelihood. So there's a great opportunity to engage farmers in ways that that connect their economic health with a changing climate. I mean, climate change is really going to affect agriculture, and it already is actually. And so so agriculture people, farmers are a great group to talk to. People of faith. I'll be honest, I'm not a person of faith, but a lot of people of faith are motivated to do right for the climate because it's important to their faith. And I can talk about that. Pope Francis has this, I mean, he came out with an encyclical on climate change. And if you don't know what an encyclical is, I don't either, but I hear it's pretty rare to do. So the Catholic Church from the top is taking climate change seriously. And there are evangelicals who are in what's called this creation care movement. We care about God's creation. And that's another opportunity for people to get involved. Another area is economic costs. I mean, let's look at rising sea levels in Miami. Miami's done for. I mean, Miami, the parts of Miami are starting to flood with high tide. And the sea levels are going to continue to rise for the next, there's no end to the sea level rise. We haven't done anything to sea level rise. If you live in Miami, you might say, well, what the hell am I going to do? Am I going to have a house? What's the economic cost to the state? And even if you're not impacted, let's say that you're a Florida resident, you may not be impacted, but other people will be. And there's a social cost, an economic cost, even though it's not your property. And in Miami, the ground is porous. So you can't build a wall around Miami. And when people understand the incredible economic costs of climate change, that resonates with them, especially people who are fiscal conservatives. So take Superstorm Sandy. Superstorm Sandy, I think, was around $80 billion of cost. 80 billion. Could you imagine if we spent a fraction of that on mitigation? I mean, we would be in a different world. So don't talk about polar bears. Don't talk about, what the temperature is going to be in 30 years. Talk about real impacts on people's lives and use a perspective that they are going to resonate with.
So really tailoring it to the audience, that makes a lot of sense. I believe, though, that Shannon has a question as well.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about how this year we've seen a collision of social justice and environmental rhetoric. And in both cases, traditionally conservative people have pushed back. And given that, given the fact that we have to equitably adapt and mitigate climate change through environmental justice, like how do we bring people over to our side in terms of social justice and climate change at the same time?
Yeah, Shannon, that is a great question. And from a practical standpoint, we don't have to. We don't have to be equitable. And we haven't been equitable. We should be. I think it's important for us to be equitable. But there's a lot of people who disagree. And let's take the Paris Accord, or let's take some of the climate accords. The United States per capita has emitted more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than any other country. The three top countries are Australia, Canada, and the United States. And so we have had the fortune of burning cheap fossil fuels for decades, and we've got economic development because of that. And it is my opinion that because we have benefited so much from our pollution, we have an obligation to help other countries develop their economies without the pollution. Now, that issue does not resonate well with a lot of people, especially people on the right-hand side of the aisle, because they don't want to subsidize development work in other countries. And they want, a uniform set of standards to be applied to everyone. So I agree with you that we should be equitable, but let's not deceive ourselves to thinking that other people agree with us. So we have to talk about equity in a way that will benefit people who don't want it. So we know that people in other countries, people of color, women suffer more from climate change. We know that there's this inequity. But if, Paul Wellstone once said, Paul Wellstone was a senator from Minnesota. He said, when everyone does better, everyone does better. Something like that, some quote like that. When everyone does better, everyone does better. And if you can frame the discussion in those terms, that can break down the barrier that people have to wanting equity. I mean, when Americans who are, look, I'm white privileged, right? I'm a 47-year-old white dude, and I've been burning fossil fuels for years. And I'm sitting here from a position of privilege. And I know that. And so my job is to figure out how can we raise everyone else up in a way that doesn't tear some people down. And it's a hard balancing act. But when other people do better, it helps everyone else. And that's the way I would frame that very discussion. But that's a really tough issue because a lot of people do not want to share the economic development that we've had because of fossil fuels.
Thank you, John. When did you realize that you sort of, when did you realize or decide that your platform could be made the most of if you engaged with journalists and if you even became a journalist? And how, like, can you think of sort of almost like structural incentives to convince other scientists to do the same? Because as you say, like in the current sort of, structure of science and science funding, there's not a totally obvious reason for them to do it.
Yeah. So how can we encourage scientists to do it? One way to encourage scientists to do it is to make sure that their first experience is a good experience. And the best way to do that is to partner them with reputable journalists who are going to be honest in conveying their views. If a scientist starts out and one of their first engagements is with a hostile journalist, that could throw them off quite a bit. I did a 2-hour phone interview with a conservative newspaper from Canada, and I did it over Thanksgiving. And I thought it was going to be a great story. And then what they did was they cherry picked one line that I said, and they totally misrepresented what I said. And if that was a scientist who is just embarking on their communication efforts, that might be enough to stop them. So now, fortunately, almost all environmental journalists are really good. You guys know the subject and you're just damn good reporters. So by being connected with people like the ones on this call, that's a great way to make that first experience a really good one. Some organizations are starting to acknowledge and honor good communicators. So for example, there's the American Geophysical Union, which now has a climate communication prize. By the way, this year's winner was Jennifer Francis, and she's a fantastic climate scientist. But when organizations like the American Geophysical Union start putting their resources into honoring communication, that's another way to motivate scientists. And then maybe the most important way is when you communicate with the public, your profile goes up. So I had a paper out in January with folks named Mike Mann and Kevin Trenberth and some big climate scientists named, and we discovered that the Earth's oceans are warming up at a rate equivalent to about 5 Hiroshima bombs per second. So I want you to imagine 5 Hiroshima bombs going off in the oceans day and night, every second for the last 30 years. Now that analogy was so powerful that our article got picked up by a lot of press around it was around January 5th, 2020. And it is now one of the top, it's in the top 1% of all media interest of any article. So when a scientist can get out and talk about their own research, it can greatly increase their profile, and it'll get more attraction to them. And that's a real benefit, especially for young scientists. So those are some of the strategies that I think about to encourage people to do it. Tom, I did such a good job answering questions that, or your group is just so smart that there's nothing more. I don't know.
No more questions. Actually, there is one in the chat from Patrick Cole that's very interesting.
Oh.
He's asking, are there any...
Okay.
Oh, do you see that one, that the from public perceptions and of responses to COVID that can help us inform the way we engage with public on climate change issues?
Yeah, I'll read that. And there's another quote from Cindy, and she corrected my quote from Wellstone. We all do better when we all do better. And I thought that was just such a great quote. Okay, are there lessons from public perceptions and responses to COVID? You know, I actually have not thought about that, but that's a profound statement, because as psychology is involved in these conversations. And let's think about COVID. The president fucked up the response. It was so bad, and we all know that. But you have a good group, a good size of the population of the United States who went along with that narrative. And now it is very difficult to admit you're wrong. I mean, we're looking at the governor in South Dakota is still not issuing a mask mandate. And we are seeing COVID rates rise like crazy, especially in areas that are more conservative. And part of the issue is people don't want to say, you know what, I was wrong. I was wrong. And the same thing about climate change. They don't want to admit that they were wrong. And so how do you get over that psychological barrier to get people to admit they're wrong? Well, I think you shouldn't wait for people to admit they're wrong, but you should find ways to propose solutions where they will benefit. So let's take COVID. I don't really benefit by the governor of South Dakota admitting she's wrong. I don't personally benefit from that at all. But if she can be encouraged, or if people who are skeptical about COVID can be encouraged to adopt practices that will be in their benefit, then they will adopt them. So people who were against masks, a lot of them are wearing masks now. And why are they wearing masks? Not because they admitted that they were wrong, but because they know it will provide personal benefit to them. So I think for Patricia's question, I think what you want to get back to is how will doing something about this problem positively affect you? And when people see the positive effects to them, it really motivates them to take action. I mean, I've got solar panels on my house, and I get paid each month for my electrical use. And when I tell someone about that, they're like, really? Really? You can be paid for doing the right thing? I once, I'll tell you another anecdote, because this is really a great one. I was walking out of a climate talk about 10 years ago, and I have a Honda Insight. I bought it in 2001. I still have it. I love it. Best car ever. And I was walking to my Honda Insight, and this lady comes out and she says, you know what? You're just a high-paid professor. You can get a Honda Insight. And I looked at her and I said, well, first of all, I'm not that high paid, but ma'am, where's your car in this parking lot? And she showed me her car. It was a very large car. And I said, how many miles do you think you'll drive that car before you get rid of it? And she said, about 150,000. And I said, and how much do you think you'll pay for gas? And this was at a time when gas was over $3. So we came to an agreement on the price of gas. It was around $3 a gallon. And what I did was I ran the numbers in front of her. I said, here's how much I will pay on gas for 150,000 miles. Here's how much you are going to pay. And you know what the difference was? $21,000. $21,000. So the savings in my car was less than $21,000. So my savings on gas from owning an efficient vehicle exceeded the cost of my car. And when I said that to her, I mean, the reasons for not doing something just melted away because she could immediately see the benefit to it. I mean, would you like a check for $21,000? I think we all would. And so rather than telling her, we got to do it for polar bears, we've got to do it for, oceans and sea level rise, I told her, do it for your own pocketbook. And that kind of thing resonates because people see the impact on their everyday life.
I think that's such an interesting
I think
story. And okay. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting story. But it does make me think about that one subset of the population who just might never change, the ones who like they hear the rational benefits in their own side of changing and they just deny it. Like there are still, at least I'm
And you know what?
even. Mhm.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Tom. And let me tell you, don't waste your time on them. Don't waste your time. I mean, there is a group of the population, maybe 20%, you will never reach. Don't even waste your time. But look at the people who are reachable, and they're reachable with logic, and they're reachable with some of the strategies. I am so sick of us tailoring our message to try to grab the most extreme anti-science people. We don't need them, and it harms our ability to connect with the people we do need.
Well,
before people get off, I do want to encourage you. Feel free to write to me or call me if you've got questions that come up. If they're a science question or a communication question, whatever they are, you can feel free to write to me at any time. I had my email up, and I'm sure you could get it from Tom Murray. But if there is a benefit to a continued conversation with anyone, I'd be happy to engage in that.
And of course, I always have to ask our last question. Do you have any advice to any young journalists who are kind of starting off, starting in the field, how they best start off?
Yeah, I do. So with respect to the issue of communicating with scientists, my recommendation is identify some scientists that you work well with and go back to them over and over and over again. So pick 5 good communicators and just use them. If you have 100 climate scientists in a room and you want to ask how many of them are going to give me a good interview with good sound bites and punchy right to the point, you're probably going to have only about 30%. So find the good ones and stick with them and build out a private network of scientists that you can go to answer your questions. I think that's because that's just going to add so much credibility to your reporting if you can couple your reporting with some top scientists who are good communicators.
Sounds wonderful. Well, if there are no other questions, I guess this is the end of our talk here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Abraham. It's been really wonderful. Quick round.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to.
Yes, thank you so much. Sadly, this is the last YCEC Speaker Series event of the fall, but we will be back in the spring, and you will all be receiving information about that soon. Yeah, and I guess I'll see you guys in the spring then.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, all right.